Adam Robbert, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
We are going to be discussing your very recently released collection of essays, Practice in Still Life, Fragments, Essays, and Lectures, which is a collection that seeks to show how basically three things fit together, which is givenness in the phenomenological tradition, the perception of, you could say, the perceiver within givenness, and the possibility of alteration, discipline, growth, and askēsis in relation to experience, in relation to that whole thing. It's a book that looks at saints, mystics, monastics, philosophers, all really revolving around being and what it is to be and what it is that can be done with the horizon of being. Far-reaching book, boldly taking on big topics, and very accessible and a great read, and just a really fantastic essay collection. But before we dive in with these topics, the origin and the structure, but also the audience, because I feel the audience is key for you. That's a big part of your work.
Yeah, so the book really, it's trying to do a number of things. You've laid out some of the sort of philosophical topics and themes that I'm interested in exploring, and we can get into those in more detail. But as a sort of medium and an arrangement of pieces, I wanted to try and do a number of things. So first of all, I guess I should say that the collection is a series of old pieces. Probably, I think I would say they're probably all from 2021 to 2024 or thereabouts. And these are, some of them are conference talks, conference papers. Some of them are more public lectures. Some of them are essays I've written. Some of them were excerpts from my dissertation that didn't quite have a home there, but I wanted to develop and work into something else. And some of them, the fragments there from the title, are quite short pieces that, they didn't quite have like a whole home for them. They were, sort of simple insights. A lot of them are just sort of explanations or explorations, I should say, of, key terms, key practices that I find interesting, maybe even just short attitudes towards philosophy before we even start kind of articulating our philosophy or trying to understand somebody else's philosophy. I feel that there are a series of key movements and practices that are happening that kind of make those later articulations possible. So those fragments are quite short. So yeah, it's varied a bit in genre, from very short pieces to sort of medium length, kind of just standard essays, and then the longer pieces, the lectures, were talks, like I said, that I've been given. So I wanted to put them together to give a broader audience a way into some of these ideas, right? I find that there's enormous value in what you could call sort of the standard approach to scholarship, wide variety of secondary literature out there, sort of really deep explorations of these topics that appear in, journal articles or conferences or things like this. And those, I think, are very important. But I think that there are other ways of presenting these ideas that don't simplify them or dumb them down, but that are a little bit more inviting, that can bring in, I would say, intellectually curious and intelligent people who don't necessarily, trouble themselves with the academic conference circuit, say. So I wanted to kind of put them all together in that sense, just from a genre point of view. But then also, I think there's something that, so much of the book is about practice and perception. I think there's something about the way that we write in academia that can sometimes close off more than it opens. it starts to become about the literature or about the secondary literature. And it can lose sight a little bit about what the work is actually for, and what the work is actually trying to do, right? And so that's really what I'm interested in. So on the one hand, you know, varieties of approaches from just a writing perspective, but then also varieties of ways into this question of being, this sort of foundational question of philosophy, the question of being, our relation to being. And really, I think what's at stake in writing in this way is whether or not you can't not only just, represent something systematic and robust and, analytically sophisticated, but can you invoke or disclose the insight, attention to, awareness of what it is we're actually talking about. And I think what we're talking about most of the time in philosophy actually is being. At least that's my claim. And so that's where the book comes from. I guess I should add also that it is a self-published volume, and I did that intentionally as well. I've published, in peer-reviewed journals before. I've published with a university press. I've, like I said, done the conference circuit thing. These are all good things, but I wanted to see today in 2025, where have we gotten in terms of the technology? What kind of a book can you put out there, as an individual? How does that work compare to, the best university presses, the best journals out there? Is there a space for that? Is that space emerging? What are the advantages of that space? What are the disadvantages of that space? So in that sense, it's very experimental. It's also kind of an outgrowth of my newsletter, of my Substack. I've been writing about these themes online for several years. Is there another layer there that's more than the newsletter? Can it sort of expand outwards into books and other media? So that would be kind of the final piece of putting this volume together. But so yeah, it's fairly experimental on a number of those fronts. But I think, whatever happens to it from here, I'm quite happy with it. I'm quite happy with having done it. And so now it's in this next phase of, this is the first conversation I'm having about it with you. Starting to get, initial impressions from people who have, bought the book or read some of the excerpts online. And so now it's kind of out of my hands, and I'm quite happy about that too. Just see where it circulates and see where it takes us, just in terms of discussion and this movement of philosophy in 2025.
It's really intriguing to me that you've brought this up so soon. I mean, and it's kind of almost a hypocritical question or statement in itself, that what you brought up about the difference between doing philosophy, engaging with philosophy in terms of what it's actually trying to do in the world, in being, as a, I don't want to say practice too soon, but like what it's actually trying to engage with, and the difference between that and talking about philosophy. And it's really strange that the difference between those two modes is actually far more subtle than people realize, but it's usually only when you get to the end of a long conference or conversation that you've listened to that you realize we've just been sort of dropping names of books or names of philosophers and maybe dates and relationships between philosophers. But there's almost like a fear. I mean, dare I say it, there seems to be almost a fear in academia to for that vulnerability, is to put some skin in the game and say, well, this is actually my, and I don't want to immediately fall into philosophical problems here, but the fear of saying, you know what, well, this is what I feel about Nietzsche. This is what I feel about the mystics. This has been my ontological experience. And there's sort of, we're falling more and more into that talking about mode. And it seems very important for you that your book is not about, but your book is thoroughly an engagement. It's not about philosophy in that sense. You are in
Yeah.
dialogue with.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about what you just said there, you do, if you're very interested in Nietzsche, for example, just because you mentioned his name, a lot of the writing that comes from Nietzsche is about Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is not about Nietzsche, right? I mean, in some sense, philosophy is autobiographical and whatever, and we can talk about that, but Nietzsche is trying to understand, you know, reality. He's trying to understand human beings. He's trying to understand history. He's pointed outward, we could say. He's trying to make sense of things in a way that a lot of scholarship about philosophy doesn't quite do. And I deal with a lot of potential dichotomies in the book. So I don't that I think in the end aren't so binary, but I think we can get lost in the study of or the study about philosophy, and lose sight of the practices of philosophy themselves and what kind of experiences or sort of events of disclosure we could say that they're actually sort of meant to be productive of. In some sense, this is about your life, this is about your perception, this is about your practice and your engagement with this thing we call being. And that shows up in many different ways for many different thinkers in the book. And I think on the one hand, there's the philosophical side, but one thing I try to do is be attentive to the ways that question shows up differently when we move from, philosophy in a strict sense to theology, to religion, to certain modes of mysticism, say. These are all sort of entangled views with entangled practices in my mind. And there's good reasons for thinking about why philosophy might be different from religion, et cetera. But if we want to really think about being, and if we want to think about these sort of really high value terms like transcendence and immanence, or time and eternity, universality, contingency, we need to, in my view, engage with theology and with religion, and with these modes of mysticism that are also disclosive of reality in ways that aren't available in a more analytic mode, I would say. So for me, it's about bringing those different perspectives together, not necessarily hoping for a higher synthesis or anything like that, but just to let them both sit in their sort of productive differences, but also to engage seriously with them. And so I have my own commitments. I lay some of them out in the introduction. I think my selection of people that I think is important to think about also tells you something about my own commitments, my own sort of reality claims and orientation. But it's not, I don't have an evangelical sense to me. I don't have an urge to bring you over to my side. It's very much more a kind of a sort of a show and tell of, these practices have been enormously transformative and productive for me. Here's how, here's some of them. Maybe they'll also be interesting to you. And maybe also it produces some disagreement, and I would welcome that as well. I think that kind of difference, and to your point about academics, I think it's a good place to start, just laying out your reality claims, laying out your commitments, and then having discussion from there. Otherwise, I think we can hedge a bit too much. We can go a little bit meta too much, or we can look at similarities too much, perhaps. So for me, this is just sort of very clearly like my idiosyncratic journey, and a kind of philosophical reflection on it in these different pieces.
Speaking of reality claims, you really do go right back down to, metaphorically speaking, the root. Givenness and being, you can't reduce much further than that, and then you move swiftly into the horizon and directionality. What could be possibly built or learned or disciplined from that, which will eventually lead us to askēsis. But maybe I should start with givenness because it's really the place to start. And I
Yeah,
don't know if you wanted to begin with givenness.
sure. Yeah. So givenness, this is a word we hear in phenomenology, right? It basically just refers to what presents itself to your awareness, what presents itself to your perception. And I use those terms flexibly. And when I say perception, I just mean basically what is, and that can include thoughts and feelings, emotions, memories, intuitions, the immediate objects of your perception, in your external sensorial environment. Um, we start wherever we are, wherever, whether it's like literally at childbirth or when we start to think about what's happening philosophically, we start in the middle of a bunch of things already happening, already arising, already presenting themselves. The philosopher Alvin Noe uses the term presence instead of givenness. He says there things are presenting, there is presence happening, that kind of thing. And that's where we start. Wherever we go from there, right? Wherever our philosophy ends up, that's the starting point for me. And so, like in the introduction, I talk about William Desmond. He's one of the big influences on me for this perspective, and he talks about an aesthetic openness. And so our primary relation to being, to what is this aesthetic openness. There are sensorial phenomena. There are sensorial phenomena combined into the objects of our perception, the events of our perception, and things like that. But it's very basically aesthetic first.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says that's sort of home ground for philosophy. And when we think about philosophy as often presented in the sort of public consciousness, we think of it as the application of like reason and rationality, analytical discourse, logic, conceptuality, the analysis of concepts, the appropriateness or adequacy of concepts, we could say, coherency, that rational consistency, all of those things. And Desmond's point is that, okay, that's good. We don't want to let go of that. That's sort of ineluctably part of what makes philosophy unique, that whole discursive apparatus. But that's actually quite downstream of our phenomenology, of that original givenness. And so part of what I want to do, and part of what I think Desmond wants to do, is say, hang on, we're skipping several steps here, or at least we're kind of hiding our work and starting quite late. And so he uses this image that I love of William of Ockham, right? He uses the metaphor of Occam's razor, right? Where we're trying to simplify, we're trying to reduce what's the simplest possible explanation here. But he says, there's a couple of things going on there. So one, there's a razor, there's this tool, and the tool implies a tool user, somebody wielding it. Okay, what's going on with the wielder? And the fact that we're engaged in this, practice of cutting, in this metaphorical sense, already implies that there's a richer moreness to things that's being cut. And so I'm really interested, on the one hand, that aesthetic surplus, that aesthetic openness, and the person, and this is where I think the practices really become essential, because even if your project is this sort of project of cutting, the sort of logical, incisive, even sort of reductive maneuver, that's still a skill, right? And so we're talking about the skillfulness of the user. And so a lot of this stuff about practice and askēsis is, how do we develop those skills? How do we become skillful users of these implements of philosophy? And when we look at it from this broader space, we realize that we probably need a variety of tools, or variety of activities, a variety of practices that can relate us to or engage us with all this aesthetic surplus, and of course the question of where does the aesthetic surplus come from? Where is presence coming from? Where is givenness arising from? And so that's the question of being. Why is there anything rather than nothing? in its basic formulation. But so that, yeah, there are those components there. There's givenness. There's the person things are given to, or the perspective things are given to, and then there's this sort of horizon, this sort of larger, structured or semi-structured field in which this givenness is like sort of given context and meaning. So those are the kind of the basic premises. And then the question is, what shapes the field? What shapes the horizon? What shapes what gets given? What shapes how it gets given? And what kind of agency or freedom or direction or wisdom might we have available in that shaping, right? And so that's kind of the premise and the starting point of the whole book in general. And then there's so many ways of approaching that question, and that's where we go into mystics, saints, monastics, philosophers. They have different ways of shaping givenness, shaping the horizon.
It's interesting. You spoke earlier about we sort of make this leap and we hide our working. We ignore being. We moved on. We end up in this realm of absolutely top heavy with concepts, and then we usually dance around in a structure made of concepts that we don't really look at the foundation that we've come from. And then you can pull one thing out, like Kant said, if you pull one thing out from my system, the whole thing will collapse, kind of thing. And it's intriguing that you mentioned concepts, or you mentioned terms such as monas and surplus, and addition. You didn't mention addition, but that is an addition, we could say, or something, okay, now maybe a now what, like what of this, how do I use my razor? What tools am I going to use? And in relation to Desmond's openness, which I love as well, the porosity of being, how does one avoid that notion, that felt sense of surplus or moreness becoming control, becoming like a bordering off and actually getting away from openness in a sort of haste to define and boundary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so one response to what I'm saying that I could imagine is that, many people might agree with the description I just gave. So yeah, of course there's more to perception and more to experience than what we're speaking about in our philosophy, what we're trying to lay down in our logic. But we're trying to, when we're doing philosophy in this mode, we're trying to, again, cut away all of the inconsistency. We're trying to cut away the surplus. We're trying to get down to what's really real, right? So there's a sense that some people may accept, the porosity, the aesthetic surplus, the openness, all of these things, but kind of in a mode of like, well, okay, a lot of this might be illusory. It's maybe not veridical. Maybe it's too subjective, or it's too perspectival, or some of these things. So, sure, yeah, we can say that's there, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in, reality in itself. We're interested in objectivity. We're interested in logic. And so my question is just, okay, it's probably not all illusory in that sense. And even if it is aesthetic in the sense of a kind of a presentation that isn't complete, isn't total, your appearance, the sense of appearance doesn't have to be perfectly coincident with what's kind of at root real, but there's quite a lot there for philosophy to think about, and maybe some of the really important things are there in philosophy. And so the move you're describing, I think, yeah, it's kind of this sort of utilitarian and instrumental imposition on our thinking, that our thinking ultimately should aim at control, manipulation, prediction, and eventuate in things like technology, science, engineering. I'm not against any of those things.
I just want to say, I think that's the only thing that thought, if we're going to use the word thought, I think that's the only thing it can do, because it's the nature of language is to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about like poetry?
Isn't that cool? Is that yeah, all right.
Well, so this is what I'm saying, right? Is that there are these alternate modes of one, invocation or disclosure. Poetry kind of engages with awareness and being in a different way. Philosophy engages in a different way. But we're in these acts of trying to relate to ourselves and to being and to each other in a multiplicity of ways. And so some of them are oriented towards truth, but then, in terms of like the big three, some of them are oriented towards like goodness and morality. Some of them are oriented towards beauty and aesthetics. But these are all fundamentally, for me, and it sounds a bit simplistic, but if we kind of unfold the whole idea, it starts to kind of make sense in a coherent way. These are all ways of invoking or disclosing being, right? And so when we have this narrowly instrumental view of, so I would say what you're describing is a certain kind of thinking as calculating, and then the question is that the only kind of thinking that's available to us? And I think no. And I think in history we have, this sort of rich, we could call it a phenomenology of contemplative thinking, of even reasoning as a kind of relating, as opposed to a kind of controlling or predicting, say.
Could you give examples, like between maybe one example of what you consider contemplative thinking?
Yeah. So, I mean, the aspects of that I talk about in the book come up, frequently in the contemplative traditions, but they really come back to, old Greek notions, Plato and Aristotle of, distinctions between like noesis and dianoia, this kind of contemplative receptivity versus this kind of linear analytical thinking and the relationship between the two. In the Cloud Author, the Middle English mystic, we get a similar distinction between this Middle English word mind, which is M-Y-N-D, and reason. And there we get, a similar description of mind, or nous, as something more encompassing and whole, that's kind of receptively in the background while the linear analytical reasoning is taking place. But the linear analytical reasoning is kind of given context and is placed within this larger contemplative mind. And the sense we get from these traditions, from these practices, is that that sense of mind as noesis, isn't something that kind of turns on and off, or that you have to find. It's always there. It's just a question of your awareness of it, right? And this mode of, I would say, it's sort of receptive awareness, again, puts us in a different relation to things. It lets them show up in a different way that's different from the analytical mind. And we are very heavily skewed in our educational institutions, in our incentives to relate to the world, to prioritize that analytical thinking, and it's only part of the story, and it's only part of philosophy, and especially if you're interested in these larger theological questions, larger metaphysical questions, that contemplative side is absolutely essential to understanding, who you are and what the world is.
You mentioned the institutional settings. You say on page 8, institutional forms aren't simply patterns to be implemented from the outside, but collective achievements that emerge from within coordination itself. And so I wonder, maybe if I was to backtrack a little bit about what I said between these two forms, and thought always trying to control, is that control aspect then is at least I see it, is that it's when you have to communicate. It's when you have to try share and coordinate, because then you have to bracket things off and say, well, this is what we're talking about. And it's interesting you mentioned the cloud of unknowing, because I think this is a good example of probably what I meant, well, what I tried to mean, I think, by control, is that is as is perhaps all negative theology, we could say, is that the writing of it is always caught in a paradox.
Yes.
And so this is kind of what I meant, is that if the language is going to accept itself as that, especially when it comes to communication and coordination, is that language is of a form that can only point towards that which it's writing about, but can never really fully get you there. And so I'm intrigued by institutional forms that are coordination, but are somehow beyond what we'd consider common reason. And your book is an example of this, I think, as well. And your work, it seems to be an example of this. And I mean, it very much like the negative theological tradition. It's almost like you can only do what you can do, or you can only do what language can afford you.
Yeah. I'll say one more thing about language, and then we can talk about the institutional piece there. Language, I think, is often understood as something that maybe separates us from immediacy, or something that, like you said, is not the thing itself, but points to it. But it's also, I think, in the sense of invocation, I think it brings things to presence if you're writing in a certain way. Concepts can do the same thing. We likewise can think of concepts as these mediating structures that, again, kind of put some distance between us and what they're mediating. But I think they, again, can bring us closer to things as well. They can bring things to presence if we approach them in a certain way. And so I think language is always doing that. It's always, in some sense, it's pushing some things back and bringing some things closer. But if we think of it as this kind of relational dynamic, as opposed to just a representational one, I think it changes what language is and does. And I think we see this in the Christian mystical traditions that I engage in. I think we do see that even in something like an apophatic assent, in the negative theology, there's a relation there between thought and contemplation, or thought and prayer, right? Where certain bits of scripture, certain types of prayer are using language, and yes, at some point they're kind of maybe in a Wittgensteinian sense, they're kind of a ladder we can use to ascend, and at some point we need to kick away the ladder and something else happens. But they're there, and they're part of the ascent, and they're part of you could think of them almost as affordances, say, in the sort of psychological sense. They afford certain things to happen, as opposed to just representing things happening. They afford things to happen. And then on the other side, Martin Laird has this great word, logophasis, which is basically like, in this apophatic ascent, you move into silence, you move into darkness. But the experience somehow, he uses this beautiful language, like it bedews, like it creates dewdrops, like it's a bedewing thing. And so there's like this kind of like, it bedews language. And so you come out the other side, and whether through poetry or some kind of an insight, you write it down. And so on the way in and on the way out, there's language, and that language can be, richly supportive and an elaboration of an experience rather than a way of closing it down, right? And then to your point, the insight that you write down, or the description, the account that you write down, might be quite salutary and useful to somebody else, and we can talk about it and exchange and deepen our understanding of what we're doing. And I guess that's, to connect it to the institutional point, I'm very keen on thinking about these things in their institutional mode. And I think this is one of the important things that, especially if we're doing philosophy in these sort of online spaces, or maybe in a more autodidactic or standard institutional forms of these things, we need to think about, what does that collective dimension look like for us? Is there a new institutional form that's available there? And I think that's important, not just for the sort of the coordination side, um, but it's important in the sense that I think we think in traditions, right? We don't think just as isolated individuals. Even though right now in our sort of postmodern context, we do have a lot of sort of uh, isolated individuals kind of picking from different traditions and mixing them up and creating these hybrids. The traditions are still there. And one of the things I'm invested in is thinking about those collective modes, those institutional modes of practice transmission, say. And so the institutional form there, it's kind of like at the edge of my thinking on this, but I think of the institutional form something like we would think of, a Platonic or an Aristotelian form. Is there a kind of a form to the institution? So on a structural level, it's kind of a conversation about, bottom up versus top down organization, sort of immediate iteration and experimentation versus some kind of laid out systematic plan. What's the relationship between those two? So there's that question, but there's also the deeper question for me is what becomes possible in the traditional form that's not possible in the individual form. And I think, again, there are these modes of understanding or these modes of shared or collective experience that only become possible in the properly structured social arrangement that's existed, for some time throughout history. So there's the institutional side to this question of perception and givenness. Do things show up differently for the group than they do for the individual? And I think the answer is yes. And that's another thing that I find a little bit underplayed, even in the practice literature, even in this, this practice oriented.
Could you expand on that, on how that givenness changes for the group?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, I mentioned that the book is quite biographical. And so it's a lot of it describes kind of my own, in a sort of distanced way. I don't really mention myself in the book, but, it's kind of where my thinking has led up to so far. And so one of the things that I pick up in the book in one of the chapters is this dialogue between Charles Taylor and William James. So Taylor wrote, it was a public lecture he gave and then published as a book, I think almost 20 years ago now. It's called The Varieties of Religion Today. And it's about James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And Taylor is, throughout it, very much, supportive of James, very appreciative of James's work and his writing. I'm also very appreciative of James and his work. But Taylor picks up there, in the varieties and in James's kind of attitude of pragmatism in general, he picks up, this sense of like, okay, James is emphasizing experience, obviously, right? So for him, religious experience is the primary, most important thing for James. And everything that comes after that, James describes it as like a cooling off from like the initial heat, the initial, the initial fire of the actual religious experience itself. There's this cooling off, and then a kind of like a sort of a sedimentation, a kind of routinization. The revelatory experience gets codified into a set of rules and texts, and then institutions, the church he's speaking of specifically. And he sees this as kind of distant from the primary thing, the mystical experience. And James, of course, likes that because, he likes this kind of, this sort of pragmatic kind of verifiability. Like, can you go out and experience this for yourself? And what does the experience do to your life? Did it have positive consequences? Okay, let's keep it. Did it have negative consequences? Maybe not. And so Taylor is saying, this is great. This is all well and good. but are you really right about the cooling down? Are you really right about the institutional side? Are you really right about the sort of the sort of more systematic? Here, I'm going to defend the systematic side of reason. The sort of the comprehensive sort of rational theology that goes along with the experience. And Taylor's point is, I think you're missing something, James. I think you're missing, like a really key element, and that is the community. That is the community of practice. That is this historical lineage. And there's something there that probably isn't available to the isolated, individualized mystic, right? And so in this biographical sense, I sort of see myself as this Jamesian character, or have been this Jamesian character. And, just reading Taylor's book, I was like, oh, this applies directly to me. This is an attitude that I've held, for most of my life. And so the institutional question comes back there. It's not just about, Taylor's a Catholic. He's thinking about his tradition. He's thinking about James's relation to Christianity versus Taylor's own. But it also applies to philosophy. I think philosophical schools are such an important part about philosophical practice and philosophical work. And that's more than, I would say, like, a philosophical school is more than just a community, or more than just a gathering of people coming together to talk about philosophy every now and again. It's a structured thing. It's oriented around, the different schools. If you take the Greek context, it's Stoicism or empiricism or Platonism. These schools have their own sort of reality claims, their own telos. So when I talk about sort of purpose and aim in the institutional piece there in the introduction, that's what I'm gesturing towards, is that there's an aim here. And what is the aim? And the aim should be some kind of an organizing principle, some way of the form of the thing folding back into the structure of the people who are practicing within it, right? And so there's an open question there for me. Do the existing forms have to be the way that they are? We started this conversation talking about some of the pitfalls and some of the incentives in the academic space, in the university space, which is mostly where philosophy lives today. Are those incentives and aims the right ones, really, for philosophy all of the time? I don't think so. So there's an opportunity there, right? So we talk a lot about I'll stop there.
Well, my immediate thought there is, it may very well be that there's becoming a more apparent separation between academic philosophy, which is almost neurotically structured, and that I don't even mean that in a mean way. There are times when this sort of hyper-contextualization and massive footnotes and really getting down to, well, actually, did that person mean that? That can really matter, especially if a philosopher is sort of being co-opted. Because I think what you're pointing out about what other forms can these institutions take, or what other forms can this engagement take, especially in this day and age. I mean, you mentioned your book is self-published, and it's on par in terms of quality, we could say, with anything put out by the big name publishers now. And so there's sort of this strange discrepancy now between all these modes of how things and thought used to be produced. It's become far more open. But these other modes, I think we are starting to see them almost be, and I don't want to mention any specific names, really, but various online thinkers, should we say, starting their own schools, or starting co-opting philosophy and sort of, in my own opinion, bastardizing it to become overly targeted. It's losing that openness to become, sort of using Nietzsche or using certain philosophers for these very specific aims, and so it loses its openness. And I wonder what the third the third path is there to retain that openness, and but at the same time to have a coordinated community that doesn't end up in basically light political ideology.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think I mean, I think the honest answer is that we don't actually know what that form is or should be. And it's not clear. It's not clear to me that we even need one of those forms. I could be wrong about this. I'm open to discovering that. But I want to discover that through trying. I want to discover that through building. But I think you're right. There's obviously I'm engaged in these things because what's available isn't the thing I'm looking for. If it was, I would go join one of those things. I'd show up, I'd say, give me a shovel, let's start digging. I don't see the thing I would like to see emerge in the world. I don't see it anywhere else. So I'm trying these various experiments to see what's important. One thing that I do believe is important is in-person community, in-person institutional life, probably especially attached to the location that place is built. So I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. A lot of what I think about along these lines is something for this place, not something for everywhere, something for this place. And I think there's so much possibility in doing these things online. So a lot of these schools are online. I think that's great. I think if it works, and I think, people who, especially if the person who has founded this thing is, sort of like in an honest pursuit of like what excellence and truth and understanding in these things, let's go. And if the people who show up to that and engage with it are now engaging with things that they didn't have access to or wouldn't have otherwise, this is all good. At the same time, I think the internet especially also gives us the sense that, it's so easy in some sense to start a podcast, or, I've had a blog and now a newsletter or whatever. It's so easy to just write and hit post, and then people show up, and then, you can do online courses and online classes also fairly easy. The hard problem is in person. And I think in the same way that, communities and institutions can bring us to different modes of awareness or different modes of a transformation, I think being together in physical spaces does something very specific. And I think the root of philosophy, certainly in Plato and Socrates' sense, is this being together of human beings in a room, in live conversation, in the dialectic. And that piece, I think, actually would go some ways towards alleviating a little bit of the, I hear what you're describing as a kind of audience capture, or a kind of putting a thinker or a philosophy to work for your ideology. The online spaces, the algorithmic mediation, the audience capture, again, makes it quite easy to do that and to sustain those modes of kind of narrowly ideological thinking. And I think that's why we see so many of them multiplying. It's an artifact of the medium in some sense, in a way that I don't think it would happen in quite the same way in person. There's of course other problems for in-person communities, but I think it would be different.
You said you don't see in the world what it is you sort of feel should be there, and in your book you mentioned the notion of spiritual authenticity, and maybe we could also say philosophical authenticity. Do you think this is what it is to be authentic, is to have that felt, even maybe ontological sense of there is some mode that I'm not seeing, I'm not feeling, there isn't a full engagement with. And to be authentic is to just keep hammering towards that until something emerges, even if it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And the conversation around authenticity really, for me, comes out of Charles Taylor again, his work on those themes. And I think, yes, that word, it's kind of a troubled word. It's one of those words that, like, obviously everybody, more or less wants to be authentic, but it's the term circulates in, I guess, inauthentic ways, we could say. It's kind of too easy sometimes. But I would think about it. I would think about it like this, and I would take it back to this initial moment again of givenness. So that's this aspect of givenness and the horizon and the shaping of the horizon. That's kind of one piece of the project, right? But the sort of the next step in that process is, okay, within your horizon, now that you're kind of aware of it, now that you kind of have some freedom, some self-reflective relation to it, what is it that you decide to pay attention to? What is it that either, you're either making a choice, and why are you making that choice and not another one? But the second part of this, which I think is the less commented on one in terms of phenomenology and practice traditions, as I see them discussed, is again this solicitation. I don't, when I explore my own phenomenology in this sense, when I explore the givenness, I find a sense of solicitation. I'm being drawn towards certain things and away from others. I'm choosing to attend to certain things and not others. And the consequences of that attention turn out to be really significant, right?
Is that distinctly moral?
So this is the question, right? And this is one of the pieces that I try to explore in one of the pieces. It's called Turning and Conversion, and it's a piece on conversion. Literally means turning around. So turning and conversion, but it's this sense of, once you kind of engage with your awareness in this sense, you do start to turn towards certain things and turn away from other things. You have to. And is that a moral question? I think the interesting thing is that the moral question and the perceptual question emerge as kind of two sides of the same coin. So your attention on one level is a selection amongst perceptual criteria, but that choosing is itself also a moral decision. This is more important to pay attention to than that, whatever the this is. I'm choosing that. And there's a moral valence to that selection. And of course, in the moral valence, you're only being drawn morally in that direction because of how that thing appears to you. So the perceptual and the moral are really entangled in every moment of your sort of everyday perception. And so this question of conversion, and this will get back to authenticity at some point, you have to be sort of kind of authentically aligned with what you care about, and you have to be pursuing that. That's the one thing. And the other thing is that because of what the human being is, the human being, in my view, is fairly open-ended. It's open-ended in a way. I would say that other creatures, other animals aren't quite open-ended in the same way. So what we choose to attend to ends up transforming who we are, right? So where you spend your time, where you focus your attention, doesn't leave you the same. You actually start to take on those characteristics. There's a kind of there's feedback loops. There's a kind of migration of your attention, the thing you're attending to, and how it's shaping you as a person. So again, that moral dimension is really important there in terms of your hierarchy of importance, but also in how it's going to transform you further down the line. So we see this in a variety of different traditions. So in the piece, we can talk about, different religious and communities, Christian and Jewish communities. Pierre Hadot writes a lot about this. In Stoicism, there's a great attention to sort of like the reason of the human mind, kind of aligning with the logos, the reason at large in the universe. So what you're trying to do is align your attention to the larger logos, the larger pattern. In the Christian tradition, you're trying to align yourself with Christ. That's kind of your attention is focused on Christ as the exemplar of human beingness. But all of these things have these recursive loops, right? So, but you have to start somewhere. You're not gonna show up immediately aware of what it is that you should pay attention to. But what you do have in these sort of very basic origin moments is things like curiosity, wonder. For Eric Voegelin, this is sometimes confusion or disorder. You notice like disjunctions. You notice that you're not quite aligned with other people or your environment, or maybe you feel aligned, but you're witnessing immoral activity, you're witnessing injustice, you're witnessing things that kind of make you go, oh, this isn't right. And you don't know what that is. You don't, in the initial moment, actually get the full story, but you have some sort of a pull. Eric Voegelin calls it the kinesis. This is movement, right? So you could think of philosophy as a series of movements, as this kind of kinetic activity. So you're pulled in a direction. Your attention gets pulled, and you don't know at the beginning why this direction, but that initiates what he calls the zetasis, the investigation. So there's the pull, and then there's the investigation, right? And the investigation part, we could say, is, again, we're now back in the sort of regular terrestrial mode of philosophy, where you're investigating things, you're trying to reason things out, you're giving accounts, you're sharing them, you're arguing back and forth. There's dialectical exchanges and all this kind of stuff. Is my account any good? What do you think? But again, all of that is downstream of the pull of the movement. Why did you move in that direction in the first place? And so that, I think, is the question of authenticity, right? Like, are you following that impulse? Are you following that seeking, that lure, that solicitation, that movement, and then living in self-reflective relation to it? You may discover that, what you've been paying attention to actually ends up being quite bad for you, or wasn't what you thought it was. And so then that can trigger, another kind of turning, another kind of conversion, where you turn away from that thing and you start, now you're saying, oh, now I need to focus on this. This is actually what I was after, but you don't know any of that to start off with. So they end up being consequential movements, but you don't have like complete knowledge of what you're moving towards in the beginning, right?
Can you get stuck there? Can you get stuck somewhere? I'm sure you can, but what are the reasons for getting stuck? Willfully clogging up that openness again and just not wanting to pay attention for ease, for comfort?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can definitely get stuck. And that's why, we haven't talked too much specifically about askēsis yet, but that's practice, right? And that's stuckness. Peter Sloterdijk writes quite a bit about askēsis, this practice-oriented philosophy as spiritual exercise, as Hadot says. But he uses the term, the practices are possession-breaking measures. So in other words, you can get stuck in your conceptual space, in your set of representations. You can get stuck in your ideology. You can collapse your ideology. You can use the ideology to collapse that openness, collapse that, the kind of the mysterious nature of the surplus. You can use it to collapse those things, and you can get stuck there. And if you do get stuck there, you need to achieve some kind of escape velocity from your own sort of representational apparatus, right? And that's one of the things askēsis will do, is that it will free you up of those representations, and it will it will give you kind of spaces of freedom to move, to evaluate the representations, to think again, is my representational sort of apparatus adequate to what I'm doing? Is it still a kind of authentic truth seeking, or have I given up that project in favor of aligning with a group, thinking only thoughts that are advantageous to me in my career, my political tribe, whatever. All of these things are ways of getting stuck, and askēsis is the way of getting unstuck. And I can give you a very old and specific example of how that works if you want to, but I feel like I'm talking quite a bit.
No,
so
sure. I'd love to hear the example.
Yeah. So, I mean, the example that I give in a couple of places is Plato's very familiar allegory of the cave. The initial move there, I would say, we talk about Greek paideia. It means literally child rearing, right? Or child development or something like that. But, when you think of paideia as the educational system, you think of it as a way of sort of like training and cultivating a certain kind of moral and intellectual excellence for participation in civic life, right? This is kind of like the standard definition of paideia as an educational system. But Heidegger and others have a more this kind of practical or movement oriented sense of paideia. And Heidegger situates it again as this kind of turning around. And he gives us this, 4-stage breakdown of the cave allegory, which basically goes, you start in a position of stuckness, but what you're saying, right? The prisoners are chained to the cave wall. They have the shadows, flying in front of them. But they can't move. They can't turn around. They're stuck. And the opposite word, apaidusia, like lack of paideia, means can't move, can't turn. So the first movement is just looking and turning, right? And you if you do that turning move, you start to see that actually there's a source generating the representations that I've been kind of clinging to as real. And you kind of go, oh wait, these are things sort of in some sense being manufactured and presented to me as real, but they have a source. And what is that source? And so that first step is just noticing that in the movement. And then the second step is freeing yourself, right? You're freeing yourself from those chains so that you're no longer stuck there. And Heidegger says something very interesting about this. He says, that seems like freedom. It seems like, you've broken free of the chains, you can move around. But he says, this is not yet freedom. This is actually kind of a dangerous space to be in. Because now that you have freedom, you don't actually know which way to move. You don't know what to turn towards. Just because you're now off the chains doesn't mean that you have a good sense of where to go. And so that third sense is, the ascent, right? The ascent out of the cave. Okay, so you found the direction, right? And so okay, I need to go up there. I need to go that way. He says, okay, now this starts to look like something like freedom. You're not just free to move, but you're free to move in the right direction. So the ascent begins. And then you get up out of the cave, you see the sun, the call it the condition of the possibility of representation as such or something. It's the illumination that makes it possible for things to appear at all. And so you find that you have this, kind of sort of revelatory moment outside of the cave. He says, but this is also not really sufficient either. If you just stay there, this is also kind of an incomplete project. You have to go back down, right? So that's the fourth move, is you come back down, and Socrates is his sort of canonical figure of coming back down, because it's quite risky. It's quite a risky move, right? Because now you're going back down. You have all this understanding of what's generating appearances, what's generating the representations, and especially of what's being generated down in the cave in these manufactured representations. And so there's these normative structures that apply at these different stages of ascent and descent. And if you come in with your, sort of illumined normative structure and start to tell people about that, down in the cave, they'll get quite upset with you. Some of them will get quite upset with you. You know, there's guards down there and so on. They're trying to like enforce this kind of perspective. So he says, you know, Socrates did that and they killed him for it. So, you know, be careful. But this is essentially the sequence of movements, right? It's one, you're kind of grip, you're stuck, you turn, you become aware, you free yourself, you're able to move, but the normative structure there is kind of like, oh, we can move around, but there's no necessary sense to like what we should move towards. Then the ascent, you say, oh no, there is actually like a way we should go. There is a vector here, and then coming back down. And so all of this, I would say, is a representation of these spiritual exercises, of the philosophical practices that, again, reshape your horizon of perception, right? So you can think of these different stages in terms of how things are appearing on your horizon, right? It doesn't have to be so literally this cave metaphor, but we can understand what it has to say about our horizon of perception. So I would think of, you know, when we think of different kinds of askēsis, different kinds of ascetic practices, you know, we have like contemplation and meditation, but we also have like trials of endurance, sometimes like physical trials of endurance, fasting. Some of them are like acts of memorization, these sort of arts of memory where you're kind of strengthening and changing your arts of memory. But what happens is, in addition to the transformation, is that you're letting go of the stuckness, and you're starting to get to this place where you can move freely, right? And so I think if you can keep that in mind, that the movement is essential, then that's your best strategy in terms of avoiding the stuckness, avoiding getting stuck in one of these spaces.
To draw in another little quote from your book, from page 46 into this, the nonconformist is today the highest and most common form of conformity. Because I was thinking while you're talking that, what is it for someone to undergo that process, that 4-stage process from Heidegger in relation to Plato's cave that you just outlined? And in relation to Plato's cave, this notion on the 4th stage that when you return, I mean, there's a lot of danger there. I mean, in the original Plato's cave, the you know, they want to kill the person who comes back for sort of somewhat disturbing their reality, basically. And that seems then to be a position that you're in. I was thinking, well, what in the world that we've mentioned, where we have the internet and you can really build anything you want, and we are very sort of liberal and open with knowledge, and you can largely create whatever you like. What is it to actually have something that to bring something to the table that maybe not literally but metaphorically has that we want to kill you because you're disturbing us? And I think it's what you've pointed out on page 46, that the highest and most common form of conformity is non-conformity. And so these institutions that you're building aren't sort of, you know, radical waves of experience like James is on about. So you're not going to go have some high and then become some sort of intellectual cult, which we're seeing the rise of. The non-conformity seems to be the thing. The conformity seems to be the thing that is kind of dangerous. A sincere, authentic approach to what it is to be, to sit in a room together and sincerely talk about things, to not cling in that non-conformist sense to the experience of an ideology, to, you know, everything is a revolution now. And so the thing that is dangerous, maybe is dangerous about what you're building, is that conforms.
Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate hearing that reflected back to me. So yeah, that quote on nonconformity again comes out of this Taylor James dialogue that I'm kind of exploring out loud on the page. And this, I will say, you know, to your listeners, this again isn't just about my experience as a person of a certain age, growing up in a certain culture in a certain part of the United States and elsewhere, and so on. I can imagine that for other people, they already know this. You know, they're aware of this. So I'm not saying that when I say the most common type of conformity today is nonconformity, I'm speaking to I'll risk saying my people, if that makes sense. And that is a certain kind of experimental Jamesian culture of spiritual individualism that emerges out of the West Coast in California and the Bay Area, say from the 1960s on. Obviously, James is, late 19th century. But to your point, this sense of what's conforming and what's non-conforming, or what's mainstream or what's radical, these things shift, over time. So in James's period, when he's writing, it must have felt like very fresh, very liberating, very sort of on the edge of what, a certain type of activated, engaged, intellectual person was looking for and pushing for. It doesn't strike me as normative when James was writing it. It strikes me as kind of like a helpful turning of that moment, right? I think we're in a really different moment, and I think this is a part of what Taylor is talking about. And so for us, I think that individual spiritual seeker, the nonconformist, is normative in my social environment. And what does that look like? It means, again, it's the primacy of experience. It's the primacy of the individual. It's also the freedom to choose. It's the rejection of the constraints of a sort of, let's call it like a monogamous relation to tradition. It's very promiscuous. So this person selects freely from the sort of shopping aisle of spiritual and religious and philosophical options. This is a person who appropriates and combines and experiments and doesn't want to feel tied down to a tradition, and doesn't want to conform themselves to that tradition. They want to take from Buddhism what works for them, and then they want to not just take from one very complex, plural tradition. They want to take certain slices of it, and so we get not just selections from Buddhist thought and philosophy, but a very kind of like scientific version of it. It's like sort of a mindfulness. They want to take psychedelic traditions. They want to take this kind of sort of, in California, it's kind of shamanic, say, like sort of aesthetic at least. And then they want to take, whatever else they need from everywhere else, and they kind of combine it. And that's kind of been the modus operandi of the counterculture for more than 60 years. Maybe it starts in the 50s, right? If you really want to go, back to the early psychedelic thinkers. And these, I don't say this to be negative or critical, right? This is like, I grew up reading, like Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley and, all these guys. These are formative for me, James too. So it's not that. It's just a question of like, again, I guess it's a question of the stuckness. Like, are we a little bit stuck on this?
Well, what are the fruits of all of that?
Well, it ends up, I think, for me, that if you look at the negative side, and we could talk about the positives too if we want to in a second, but if we look at the negative side from a certain aerial view, this countercultural movement on a bigger timeline just, it kind of starts to look like more consumerism, more individualism. It's exactly the mode of spirituality that you would kind of predict would emerge from our particular historical and economic situation. So, I'm not a reductionist about those things in that sense, but it hangs together pretty nicely. And so, what happens, the question in broad terms is what happens when the counterculture just becomes the culture? And what, that happened to me. I would argue at length with people to say that happened. We live in a normative space largely defined.
Well, Eckhart Tolle has sold like what 50 million copies.
Yeah, Totally. Right. So, so the move for me is like, okay, if you wanted to gadfly that position, say, I think you would point out that you are producing a very large number of very similar nonconformists. And so okay, they seem like nice people. I interact with them all of the time. I'm not saying they're, bad, but it's just to Taylor's question again. Okay, where's the tradition? Where's the fidelity? Where's the community lineage? All of those things. So that's kind of, I'm moving in that direction. And I know other people are as well. There seems to be a naturally occurring counter reaction in the zeitgeist, that's heading in that direction. And honestly, I have mixed feelings about it. I have my own commitments. Obviously, there's a strong Christian element to what I'm saying. There's a strong Platonic element to what I'm saying, and Platonic in the sense of like William Desmond and Eric Pearl and Eric Voegelin. There's a particular reading of Plato at work here, that is kind of arising in me in response to this, this cultural environment. But there's many versions of it. So we all know that there's an uptick in young people in converting to Christianity, to Catholicism. There's traditional conservative movements emerging online all over the place. It's but it's this shift. If you just look at it descriptively, the younger generation seems to be more conformist as a reaction to the older generation that they're responding to, which seems kind of natural when you look at it. You can't push the counterculture indefinitely. At some point, something else has to come in. Something else has to kind of like energize the young people. And so I'm interested in that. I'm interested in where that's going, and I'm interested in, there are healthy and unhealthy expressions of that. But I think it's rooted in this sense that a lot of people feel that, this arc, this Jamesian arc from late 19th century to now, has found its limitations, and we need to now rethink.
We're in a way we're living in its world.
We're living in its world
to a degree, right? You're saying that's the single cause, but the world of that Jamesian expression is the world that we have. So,
right,
is that what you want more of? Is there anything you'd like to add about your book? I mean, it'd be a good place. Speaking of institutions and in-person things, you do have a thing in San Francisco called the Theoros lectures, right?
Yeah. I mean, with the book, I like I said, it's I guess, I don't know, 3-4 years of writing and editing and repurposing. And then, I came into it thinking sort of like, oh, I have all this stuff, and I think there were like 22 pieces originally. I ended up with 15 and the introduction. And I thought to myself, I'll just drop all these pieces in, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that ended up not being the case. So there's another like intense sort of 4-month expansion period there. Again, just because, public talk is different from a newsletter post, is different from a chapter in a book, trying to be quite sensitive to the medium. So, but yeah, it's a multi-year effort, and now for me, that part is done. And I'd like to go reality test it. I appreciate so much these questions and, this time to speak about it. And yeah, now I'd just like to learn how it lands. What, are any of you seeing this? Is any of this helpful? Is any of this just sort of like completely wrong-minded to you for reasons that I don't understand? So yeah, reach out to me. I'm available online. I'm not too hard to find. get a copy of the book, check it out. I don't have too much else to say about the content, but yeah, I'd love to just engage with people about it, in whatever format. So that's,
is there anything specific you'd like people to take from the book, or are you just want to see it land?
No, I don't, I really don't. And yeah, like I said, like the constructive building part is done. And I think it's nice to have conversations like this, let people know about it, talk about it a little bit more. And I especially appreciate, you drawing me out on some of these things so I can think about them and share them. But, I almost just want to just give it to people with no context and just be like, see how this goes. If these things are roughly in your wheelhouse of interest, check it out. And, there's no bigger point in that sense other than to share them. So yeah, that's all I think about the book. You asked about Theros. This is the other branch that I'm working on right now. If my partner in this project is a guy named Dr. Jacob Sherman. Has he been on your show? No. So you should at some point. He has a great book, Partakers of the Divine. He's working on another one right now, but I think you'd really enjoy him. He's my dissertation chair, and he's also the chair of my philosophy department. We've created an event series in San Francisco. It's called the Theros Project, or the Theros Lectures. It's a lecture series, and that word Theros is you might be familiar with the Greek for contemplation, which is theoria, which is where we get our word theory. So the Theros is the contemplative. The Theros is the person who engages in the contemplative activity. That's the primary definition. And we're rooting this event series is kind of, I would say it's a sort of practice-oriented and contemplative approach to humanity, the humanities in the 21st century. That's kind of our tagline for it. But the other two definitions of that word Theros is that a Theros is also a traveler and a representative. So you can think of we were talking a little bit about the contemplative ascent and the contemplative descent, or the ascent out of the cave and the descent back into the cave. A Theros travels in that sense. And it's kind of contemplative mode, but it's also literal travel, like geographical travel. They will actually go to other places, other cities in ancient Greece. They were travelers between the cities. They would go to events, including sporting events, but also these sort of visionary events, these sort of sacred religious rites and festivals. And they were there to observe, as the word theoria kind of implies, it's kind of attentive, receptive observation. And then they'd come back home and they'd report back on their experience, or whatever that person has experienced over there. So there's that sense of travel and then representation. And we thought that was quite a good, that figure is quite a good sort of guiding metaphor for both this kind of, this moment where we're still moving in between various institutions, visiting, conferences, talks, departments, all of this sort of standard stuff. But then also between institutions that aren't necessarily all educational institutions, different types of environments, moving back and forth between those as well. And then, just in this public sense that we're talking about, that there's renewed energy and movement outside of the traditional spaces. So we thought the Theros was quite a good figure for that. So we have a Substack for that as well. If you're in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, we've hosted, I think, 6 events now, and the newsletter will update you on who the speakers are and what's coming up next. So if you want to participate, it's in person for now, but we'd love to see you in San Francisco. If any of this sounds interesting, please come join us.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for Theros in the description below, and your own Substack, and your book that we've been talking around, Practice in Still Life, Fragments, Essays, and Lectures. This is now live. This is ready.
It's live.
People can order this. So
Yep.
yeah. So I will be sure to put the link for that in the description as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, just my appreciation. Thanks for hosting me. Thanks for, suggesting this. I think what you've done here is great and so important in terms of, building these connections, building up this space of, really rich philosophical discussion and sharing and dissemination. And I just think it's wonderful to see, and I appreciate your questions and taking the time to have me on.
Thanks, man. That means a lot. Thank you.